Hello, my beautiful little nuggets. Welcome to a segment that we are now starting that I like to call The Big Idea, wherein I'm going to take a chapter that we are talking about in class, and we're going to summarize, pack it down to the absolute most essential things that might come up on a Simpsons episode, so you would need to know to understand what's going on in the episode. In this episode of The Big Idea, we find the Cold War, which is the era after World War II, kind of, sort of up until the present, but I guess theoretically, textbook-wise, it ends in 1989. Before World War II, Russia had become a communist state, and Russia's name then becomes the USSR, which you've probably heard. And I use both kind of interchangeably, even though it's not completely accurate, but that's just how we roll. After World War II, kind of during World War II, after World War II, China does the same thing, violent takeover, and then becomes a communist nation. So the Cold War is the phrase that we use to refer to the battle of ideas between the communist East and the capitalist West. Communism versus capitalism. Which is better for running an economy and running a country?
Looking forward to this meeting.
Me too. My African ministry friends owe you many thanks, Colonel Moon. Few men had the guts to trade conflict diamonds since the UN embargo.
I know all about the UN. I studied at Oxford and Harvard. Majored in Western hypocrisy.
From your modest little collection of cars, I would never have guessed.
The USSR, Russia, and the United States, Murica, were in this battle, this ideological battle to prove that their way of doing this was best. Their way of doing this was going to be, God's gift to the entire world. And they did that in a few different ways. Like the competition showed up in a few different ways. It showed up as the arms race. We can build bigger, better, and more explosive missiles than the capitalist pigs. Watch it there, you commie pinkos. If anybody knows how to blow stuff up, it's the U.S.A. The space race. We sent Sputnik, then dog, then monkey, now human into space. Yeah, well, our astronauts have ice cream and flush toilets. Hey, flush toilets are a thing here now in the 20th century. You should try it out. And even the education race to try to prove whose kids were smarter. Our children are very good at the calculus and the physics, the writing and the arithmetics. Shoot, our kids can read way gooder than that. Now, even though this was technically an ideological battle, there were parts of it that were very real, like the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it became a physical place when the USSR constructed a wall, an actual physical wall, in the city of Berlin. And they did that because Berlin, after World War II, had been split into a couple chunks. It had the capitalist-controlled west part, and it had the USSR communist-controlled east part. And the USSR wanted to make it very difficult for its people to get from the east to the west because the east was a sucky place to live. The Cold War also involved a lot of spying on one another, or the wordy word is espionage, where there's Russian spies in the United States, and there's United States spies in Russia, and the Chinese, and who's working with who. And it led to all kinds of movies and books and plays and everything.
Business and your people get killed. We both know that.
Then, when this mission is over, I will kill you.
With this kind of high charge, like who's a communist, who's not a communist, you can't really know where they are. This fear of communists being around every corner and in your glove box and everything, your closets, led to something called the Red Scare, which had happened in the 1920s when the USSR became the USSR, but it happened again in the 1950s and 60s. It was like, okay, is this movie star a communist? Is your milkman a communist? And the color red is associated with communism because of the flag and whatnot. So that's why we call it the Red Scare. It's like, oh, everybody's a communist. It was the 1950s, and Americans were scared. Very scared. And who were they scared of? The godless communist Russians. Did they need to be scared? Probably not. Murica. I was talking to my friend Rochelle, and she was telling me that her cousin's best friend Vinny has an uncle who works in the CIA, and guess what? You know who he said is a communist? Frankie Valli.
Oh my goodness!
Oh my gosh, Ruby's girlfriend's ex-husband's cousin said that the milkman is a communist.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. The kid's piano teacher? Communist.
Principal at the kids' school? Communist.
Your mom? Communist. Ha ha! And it got so bad that there's even a name for it. There's a name for calling people something with very little proof and calling a lot of people something with very little proof. It's called McCarthyism, and it's named after the senator who was doing it. Who's from Wisconsin, by the way, so I don't know, maybe he had a little bit too much cheese and was bloated and fussy. I'm not really sure, but he was calling everybody a communist without really having any evidence to back it up, and that's why whenever you hear the word McCarthyism, like, oh, they're just, being little McCarthys or whatever, it means that somebody's being accused of calling another person or group of people something with very little proof. Now, there were times that this Cold War of ideology became quite hot, as in actual physical war. Two of those were the Korean War, which at first wasn't, for a long time, it wasn't called a war, it was called a conflict. So if you ever see on a license plate, it'll say sometimes the Korean War, the Forgotten War, that's why. And then the Vietnam War. Both of those wars are called puppet wars, where the United States goes in to support the capitalist side, and the USSR or China goes in to support the communist side. And they're kind of, the US fighting another country, but through the puppet of wherever they're at, like Korea and Vietnam.
Oh, hi, North Korea. Hello. Who are you? South Korea? That is weird because you look a lot like the US. You look a lot like Russia.
The last two things that you hear referred to about the Cold War quite often are the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Bay of Pigs was kind of a failure, like a really big one. Suffice it to say, JFK at the time of his assassination wasn't doing like super duper awesome as president. Maybe that's kind of an opinion. I don't really know. Regardless, the word on the street was that the USSR and Cuba were getting super friendly, and the United States was not excited about that at all for a lot of obvious reasons. And so the thought was, maybe we should send some good people down there, some boots on the ground and straighten things out. And that's the Bay of Pigs. It failed. And you'll hear more about that in the Crash Course American History video. The other thing that happened was the USSR set up missiles in Cuba, like facing the United States, and that wasn't like super exciting for people living in the US at the time either, as you can only imagine. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and that's kind of what's considered the end of the Cold War era, even though we still have a ton of stuff from that era that impacts current events now, and I'll be pointing some of that stuff out in the next couple weeks. But it brings up the question, why would a people stage a violent overthrow of their government to become socialist, like to begin with? A recent poll showed that 2/3 of Russians now say that they kind of miss the old days of socialism, which you have to wonder because a lot of the people that answered that poll wouldn't have been alive yet. So I'm sure some of that is rosy tinted glasses. But one of the things that people do like about socialism is that nobody is super wealthy, but everybody has what they need. At least that's the line that we're given. I found this quote. It said, everybody could afford bad food and bad clothes. Material wealth hardly existed in the USSR, at least for the majority of its citizens. But although basics were guaranteed, those who worked hard could rarely rise above mediocre level. So there's no incentive to do amazing things like there is in capitalism. The line that's kind of given consistently is, sure, nobody had it great, but nobody had it terrible either. Although I would argue that the people who were sentenced to work in the gulags for resisting their government would probably say they had it pretty terrible. That's just my assumption. That's just me saying I don't think I would like to be in the gulag personally. The thing about capitalism is there's incentive. There's incentive to create. There's incentive to build. There's incentive to grow, this empire and have an idea, be an entrepreneur like we talked about last year. That's what makes it work. And that's a part of the fabric of the American experience that's so important to who we are. And no, capitalism, the way that it exists right now in the United States, isn't perfect. It might sound kind of counterintuitive, but sometimes we have to put laws in place to protect capitalism, to protect it from cronyism, to protect it from corruption. So big takeaway from the Cold War era. It was a war of ideology that sometimes turned very hot, and lots of people, unfortunately, lost their lives because of that. Sometimes we got amazing things out of that ideological war, like technological advancements that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise if we hadn't been in such deep competition. At the end of the day, there's a lot of questions that aren't answered yet about this era in American history. Namely, the largest one probably being, how can we be competitive as a country with other nations around the world, but also be at peace? And that's one of the things that's really going to be up to your generation to try to figure out.